Complete collapse of the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region, hundreds of soldiers trapped. Before we begin, I would like to sincerely ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps the channel grow. I thank everyone who has subscribed. Today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of February 11, 2025. A lot has happened today, so let's get started. Probably the most significant event over the past 24 hours is the persistent weather conditions. The frost, which has been gripping parts of Ukraine for several days now, has effectively allowed the Russian Federation to resume decisive offensive actions. Let me remind you that from early December through most of January, the weather was completely unsuitable for conducting offensive operations. During this period, the Ukrainian side took advantage of these conditions and carried out several relatively successful counter-offensive operations, which allowed them to regain control over some lost territories. However, some offensive operations by the Ukrainian Armed Forces, UAF, were complete failures, such as the Svatove salient. Let's proceed in order and start with the South Donetsk direction, where the most important news is coming from the area of Velika Novosylka. Indeed, the most significant updates are coming from here. Today, Ukrainian mapping services made their first adjustments in the Velika Novosylka area in the past month, meaning something has happened here for the first time in a while. As you can see, Ukrainian sources report that during offensive operations, the Russian armed forces managed to cross the Mokry Yali River and effectively approach a company stronghold located northwest of Velika Novosylka. This is very important, as combat is now moving towards the settlements of Privilya and Burlatska. Additionally, a significant amount of footage of objective control has been published from this direction, showing strikes on forward positions of the Ukrainian armed forces, the destruction of Ukrainian artillery, and other developments. For example, slightly south of Privilya, footage has been released of strikes by TOS thermobaric systems on forward positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. Information about the Russian army's activation northwest of Velika Novosylka is also confirmed by various pro-Russian experts, indicating that the front has become active here, likely due to the persistent frosty weather. Next, we move to the Andriivka fortified area, where the most adjustments to the front line have been reported. Today, Russian sources repeatedly reported that the settlement of Andriivka has come under the full and confident control of the Russian armed forces. Ukrainian mapping service Deep State also reported on the very dire and critical situation of the UAF in this area. Based on everything published over the past 24 hours, it can indeed be assumed that Andriivka has only a few days left before another Russian flag is raised somewhere in its western part. Regarding the current situation, today the Ukrainian side published footage of objective control showing Ukrainian FPV drone operators striking forward positions of the Russian armed forces in the central part of Andriivka. Based on this footage, approximately half of Andriivka has been reclassified, but as of February 11th, we are only reclassifying territories that were previously considered contested. In other words, the UAF drone strike was carried out on the border of the contested territory, meaning everything behind it, to the east, is already under firm control. Today, Ukrainian sources report that the Russian army has finally cleared a stronghold in the northern part of the settlement and has effectively entered the territory of farms. In any case, all objective control footage from various sources, Ukrainian, Russian, and neutral, confirms that Andriivka has finally fallen, the defense has been broken, and only a few days remain before the entire settlement comes under the firm control of the Russian armed forces. Once Russian units reach the western outskirts, we can expect further operations, including advances towards the settlement of Oleksandriivka, which will allow the Russian army to encircle several more settlements. Possibly from the western side of Andriivka, the Russian army will attempt to strike towards Konstantinivka from the northwest, thereby closing the encirclement. Today, another interesting video was published by the Ukrainian side. In this footage, we can observe artillery strikes and FPV drone strikes on Russian units attempting to assault and attack the road between the settlements of Yasenova and Andriivka. Combat took place precisely at this point, and based on the footage, there has been a slight reclassification of the map. Just yesterday, these territories were still considered contested, but today there is no doubt that the Russian army has physically cut the road between Andriivka and Yasenova. By the way, regarding the settlement of Yasenov, today the Russian Ministry of Defense also confirmed that during the fighting, this settlement has come under the full and confident control of the Russian armed forces. Overall, we can see the trend and the direction in which the Russian army is currently striving. The main task for Russian units, as the fighting for the Andriivka pocket is nearing its logical conclusion, is to restore another logistical link between the settlement of Donetsk and the entire Pokrovsk direction. Today, according to various mapping services, both neutral and pro-Ukrainian, the Russian armed forces have managed to advance in the settlement of Zaporizhzhia, straightening the front line between Vosdvizhenka and the settlement of Serebryanka. Based on this footage, we have reclassified these territories as contested. The Ukrainian armed forces regularly attempt counterattacks in these directions, trying to slow down the Russian army's advance. For Zelensky and Ukraine as a whole, it is extremely important to prevent Russian formations from entering the Dnipropetrovsk region, as this would be a serious media blow to Zelensky's reputation and that of the commander-in-chief. In general, the question of the UAF's ability to hold back the Russian army from advancing towards the Dnipro River will arise again, as crossing this red line could lead to unpredictable consequences for NATO states. Now let's move to the Pokrovsk direction, more precisely to the triangle of Kotlin, Udakne and Pishchene. I remind you that over the past few days, we have repeatedly discussed the situation where Ukrainian formations, taking advantage of either weather conditions or the slowdown of the Russian army's advance, began a series of harassing counterattacks towards the settlements of Kotlin and Pishchene. It was unclear whether they had managed to advance or not, as most reclassifications in previous days were based on the destruction of Ukrainian equipment. When equipment is destroyed, it is difficult to make any reclassification, as it is possible that Ukrainian units entered the settlement. However, today, information about control over most of Pishchene is confirmed not only by us, but also by pro-Russian and Ukrainian experts and cartographers. The fighting for Pishchene is extremely important for the Ukrainian side, and now we will try to understand why the Ukrainian side is so fiercely counterattacking in this direction. Some experts and military analysts have already suggested that the Ukrainian side is trying to cut off this salient, located in the triangle of Udakne, Kotlin and Pishchene, encircling Russian units in this sector of the front, conducting an operation similar to what the Russian side has been doing since early 2024. However, everything is a bit simpler here. The Ukrainian side does not have sufficient resources to cut off such a salient, and even if it does, such a task is not currently a priority. If we look at Kotlin and Udakne, these are extremely important settlements for Russian formations, as control over this sector of the front cuts off at least one route used by the Ukrainian side to supply the contingent in the Pokrovsk area. If we look at this sector and try to predict or map possible supply routes, let's assume how the Russian armed forces could be supplied in the areas of Udakne and Kotlin. For this purpose, we will use the red line, the T04 highway. We can see that it is possible to supply this sector of the front from the T04 highway towards the settlement of Salo, and then from Salo towards Vovkove, and further through Vovkove towards Pishchane, and from Pishchane towards Shevchenko. Moreover, supply through Shevchenko, the area between Pishchane and Shevchenko, is not a road but a forest belt. There is no road here. The road is the T0515, which passes through territories controlled by the UAF. There is a small section of the front, approximately 2.5 kilometers, that passes through fields, mud and slush. Even if we look at this supply map for the Russian army, it passes through at least one contested territory between Uspanivka, Novovasilivka and Salo. Currently, part of the supply route passes through the part of Pishchane that has been taken under control by the Ukrainian armed forces. Now we can probably understand why the front has not moved in this direction in recent days. Next, we move to the Vosdvizhenka area. For the second time since the start of hostilities in this sector of the front, confirmation has been received from pro-Ukrainian services that the Russian army has physically crossed the N32 highway again. There are no logistical problems here. Movement along the road is possible at any time in winter or autumn, as long as there are no minefields. This has allowed the Russian army to physically cross this road. Now an offensive is gradually unfolding here, most likely along the N32 highway towards the settlement of Andriivka. Next, we move to Toretsk. Over the past 24 hours, the map has not undergone any significant changes. Separate geolocations have been published, and Ukrainian drones are flying, trying to shoot down Russian flags that have already been placed in the Zaporizhzhia micro-district. However, no significant advances have been noted. The situation is similar in Chasiv Yar. As for the Siversk direction, the map has not changed at all over the past 24 hours. Very interesting news is coming from the Lyman direction. Separate pro-Russian sources note further advances by the Russian army towards the settlement of Andriivka. Part of Andriivka is already under the control of the Russian armed forces. Based on the map published by Russian sources, the Russian armed forces have approached the settlement of Kursk, located south of Andriivka. It is possible that in the near future, this sector of the front will be completely reclassified as under Russian control, and the Ministry of Defense will confirm this information. Additionally, drones are regularly operating on supply routes for UAF units towards Lyman, meaning combat is gradually intensifying here. We also see that this is another sector of the front where it is extremely difficult for the Ukrainian side to stabilize the front line. Next, we move to the North Kupiansk direction. The main updates here are coming from the Russian bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of the Oskil River. Separate mapping services note further expansion of the Russian bridgehead, but we believe that this is no longer just an expansion, but the beginning of a large-scale offensive that is still gaining momentum. Over time, the pace will only increase. Next, we move to the Svatove salient. Here, what can be called a genocide of Ukrainian equipment moving through the settlement of Pisarivka continues. Today, another ambush was set up on equipment that the Ukrainian side was trying to transfer from the Sumy region to the Svatove district. Once again, a large amount of equipment was ambushed, trapped, and destroyed by Russian drones using fiber optic technology. We can observe a significant number of episodes, and in general, it can indeed be stated that the Ukrainian side, while on the defensive in the Svatove salient, is suffering losses not only along the line of contact, but also deep in the rear, possibly much higher than the Russian army, which is currently on the offensive. Next, we move to the settlement of Giva. Footage of strikes by FAB bombs has been published here, and it seems that something is being prepared in this sector of the front. As for Vosdvizhenka and Konopelka, today numerous pro-Russian experts have repeatedly published information noting that Vosdvizhenka and Konopelka are already under the full and confident control of the Russian Federation. All the successes of the Ukrainian army during the offensive in early February have been nullified, and preparations are now underway for a possible strike towards Svatove itself. At the same time, information continues to come from the northwestern sector of the front about further advances and expansion of the control zone in the settlement of Sverdlivka. This information has been confirmed by both neutral cartographers and pro-Ukrainian ones, who also note control over the northern and northwestern parts of the settlement. Just yesterday, the map looked like this, but today there is further expansion of the Russian armed forces bridgehead in this sector of the front. Once Sverdlivka and Lebedivka come under the control of Russian units, a flanking strike towards the main supply route in Svatove can be expected, which could lead to catastrophic consequences. Ukraine has only one chance to start some kind of truce or ceasefire before this happens. As if it fails to do so before the Russian offensive begins, a huge number of Ukrainian soldiers risk being completely encircled with no chance of evacuation or breakthrough. And that's all for now, dear friends.